There we got Hudson Bay, we got the Great Lakes. We've got the Red River Valley with the Red River running down the middle of her, draining to the north. This is the Cheyenne up here, draining down and then coming back around. This is the Missouri, which runs down and drains into the Mississippi. So we got two different drain areas here. Now we got people. And what ended up, you know, I mean, people all over. Many different tribes, but it's hard to say. I mean, they were shifted all the time, constantly, especially once they started settling the East Coast, it kept pushing the tribes further this way. But basically what you had was woods Indians over in this area. In fact, it was considered Indian territory for a long time, but that keeps changing, you know. The woods Indians were over here, the plains Indians were over here. Now the valley in between was really kind of a mutual hunting ground. Well, and there was Assiniboine Indians up in here, which were part of the woods bunch. And I've drawn in the 49th parallel, which is the border between United States and Canada now, but at the time, no such border. I mean, it was wide open country. But the Indians, like I say, this was just a vast plain, really not a good place to live, but a great place to hunt. So everybody kind of used it as a hunting ground. But then they'd winter back, get off in sheltered areas, because this was no place to be in winter. Even today it's no place to be in winter. But things are going to change. But I have to take a little detour first. I will have to bring up the Vikings. Now, a lot of dispute about the Vikings. But the Vikings were in Greenland. No doubt about that. The Vikings landed on the main continent. No doubt about that. Where the questions come in as to how far the Vikings went inland. It's interesting, fascinating reading. But there's a lot of evidence that they had been down in the Great Lakes area, went back a ways from there. You go over into Minnesota, they have the Kensington Runestone, and it's sometimes claimed to be a fraud, some claim it's original, you know, it's all up in the air. But this was like the 1300s. And even, like I say, I live along the Cheyenne River, but you get down to Fort Ransom, and they swear to God the Vikings were there too. They have all kinds of evidence. There's evidence they were up in Minot. There's pillars and stuff that have runes carved in them. It's interesting, but the fact remains they really didn't hang around. Except when Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri on their expedition after they had bought the Louisiana Purchase, they were surprised to find living with the Mandan Indians some light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, or red-headed Indians. And the theory they come up with is that Vikings, on their exploring, that some of them ended up, because the Mandans are friendly people. They kind of let anybody in with them. Otherwise, the Vikings had trouble with, everywhere they went here, with what they called the Skraelings, which was the Indians. You know, Vikings had a bit of an attitude, and the Indians kind of outnumbered them, so it just didn't work out well. Though the Vikings are huge travelers. They were all over Europe and Asia. They were just party animals. They were everywhere. But I'm going to kind of leave them out of the equation only because there's really they had no lasting effect on the area, though in later years the Norwegians come back in huge numbers, but at this time I'm kind of just leaving the Vikings out of the equation. Though the Lewis and Clark, if you read their journals, it's quite interesting. It's a bit of a surprise for them. At this time, everybody was grabbing up any land they could get their hands on, claiming it. And it wasn't hard to do because all you had to do is find a river and say, everything that drains into this is mine. Well, Henry Hudson came up Hudson Bay, kind of misjudged the weather, got iced in. But while he was here, he claimed everything that drained into Hudson Bay, which includes the whole Red River Valley and a big area here. And way up in Canada. Well, in spring when the ship thawed out, he wanted to go and take an explore and see what the hell he had claimed. But the crew mutinied. They'd had quite enough of North America. So they put him and a few of his loyal crew members into a rowboat and turned him loose, and that's the last you heard of Henry Hudson. But the bay is named after him. But the English now had their claim. And for a long time after that, this area was controlled by the English. In fact, it was a monopoly they had. They set up the Hudson Bay Company about like 60, 70 years later. It took them a while to get back. The experience wasn't that good. They weren't coming back right away. But they wanted to do some trading, so they came in here, made a deal, and thought this looked good, so being as it was theirs, that they claimed it, they set up what they called Rupert's Land, named after some damn prince, that covered a big area in here. Everything that drained into the Hudson Bay. And they had, like I say, a monopoly over it. The only competition they had going was from the French in Montreal, had this Northwest Company, and there was a lot of bickering between the two. But we're British now, and will be for quite some time. So this is all English. Even after, this at that time was still Indian territory, though, we're pushing them out from the coast all the time. This on the other side, well, it was French. He gave it to Spain, then he got it back, but it was, most of the time, it was French, done in that unusual way where they find, okay, the river drains into the Gulf down there. Everything up there is ours. It's like biting an elephant on the tail and saying, I'm going to eat this, because the Louisiana Territory went all the way up here. Way up into Canada. What is now Canada. Now, at this time, in like 1810, I think it was, one of the controlling people in the Hudson Bay Company was Lord Selkirk. Now, over in England, they had been tormenting the Scots and Irish doing these, what they call removals, where the big landowners would kick all the tenant farmers off so that they could graze sheep. They wanted big sheep pastures. So they had all these useless Scots and Irishmen on their hands. Well, this Lord Selkirk, he got the great idea, since he was a major stockholder in the Hudson Bay Company, they took a big piece of this and called it, well, they called it Assiniboine, or the Lord Selkirk Community, or Selkirk Settlement. And they tried to bring over a bunch of Scots and Irishmen. And that's really when the trouble started. But that's when you start getting into, the trouble with the Métis were already there at that time. And when the English brought in all these Scots and Irishmen, the Métis had no real title to the land, though they'd lived there for generations. But the Métis could go off on a hunting expedition, come home, and find you had a Scotsman living in your house. You know, you had no control over it anymore. But that's the way the English always worked. So eventually the Métis got pushed out, but that's in the future. They ended up trying to move away from the thing, but at the same time, the English needed the native peoples because they're the ones who brought in the furs and the meats. Them Scots and Irishmen were supposed to be farming, but they weren't doing much of a job. But so we're still English, and I think I'll leave it at that today because it starts getting more complex, as it does every time you get politics involved. But we have the Red River, the Big Valley, Cheyenne River here. This is the border of what was Rupert land. Now is that Assiniboine, or the Selkirk settlement. But it's all politics. I mean, this stuff goes on. These people living here, it had no effect on them really until you got kicked out of your house. But, you know, it really didn't matter who they belonged to. They didn't realize they belonged to anybody. They thought they were their own people. But the English are good for that. But we'll go further tomorrow. That's enough for today. It's getting dark.